Alrighty, hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining the webinar today. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and we will be looking to answer the question, how does the MITRE ATT&CK Framework align with the Cyber PHA methodology? And so we'll talk really about both approaches. We'll look at the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, we'll look at Cyber PHA, and really what we're seeing is that the emphasis on risk assessment, the awareness for cybersecurity is as high as it's been. And so with that, people are always looking for the best methodology, trying to get the most out of the risk assessment. And the methodology we're seeing be very heavily adopted there is the IEC 62443 3-2 approach. And a lot of times that can go by a couple of different names, one of them being Cyber PHA. In addition to that, one of the other approaches or strategies that we're seeing come into play a lot more now is the MITRE ATT&CK approach. And what that does is it focuses a little bit more from an adversary perspective to understand what tactics and techniques they might use to try to gain access to a system and achieve their goal. And so with that, we'll look at both approaches and then try to understand, is there a combined approach we can do that takes aspects from both? How are they related to each other? And hopefully help to answer some of those questions that you might think about for your next risk assessment. Some quick background on me. I am Patrick O'Brien, and I'm a senior safety and cybersecurity engineer at exida. I've been working at exida for a little bit over 7 years now with a background in chemical engineering, so started out a little bit more on the process safety side, leading lots of HAZOPs and really the entire functional safety lifecycle from risk assessment through LOPA and SIL verification for oil and gas customers, specialty chemical, really anything in the process industry. But I've also spent a lot of time working in other industrial applications like mining, steel mills, manufacturing type environments. And so also have seen some machine safety aspects. And then about 4 or 5 years ago now, I also became heavily involved with our cybersecurity activities and really understanding for those industrial applications, how can we take steps to make them more secure and what do we need to do to protect our control and our safety systems? And so as part of that, I've had the opportunity to work on a couple of really great book development teams. So I'm a co-author for the exida book, Implementing IEC 62443, A Pragmatic Approach to Cybersecurity, which was first released back in 2018. And I was also the project leader and one of the main authors for managing cybersecurity in the process industry, a risk-based approach. And that is a new CCPS concept book that actually just came out this year. And so some quick background on exida. We are a customer-focused company, and so we work directly with our customers to help them achieve safe, reliable, and secure solutions. And we do that through 3 main ways. The first way is our enterprise tool. So we have the Excellentia platform as well as the OEMX platform. And really our goal there is for safety, security, and alarm activities to provide a consistent framework to help our customers not only complete the tasks that they need to for the life cycle, but to do it more efficiently and more consistently so that we're again always having high quality outputs. From the certification and assessment side, we are an accredited certification body to a number of functional safety, machine safety, automotive, and cybersecurity related standards. And so we can work with OEMs and other companies to certify their processes, their components, and their systems. And then lastly, for our lifecycle services, this is the area that I primarily focus on. But we work directly with the end users or the asset owners to help complete risk assessments and solve the toughest lifecycle problems as well as to really kind of bring that knowledge from the other areas together so we can understand what products are out there, and we have tools to use when we go through and complete the projects. And so for this webinar today, we will split it up into three main parts. The first part will be the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, where we look to understand a little bit more about what that is, where it comes from, and also how we can take and then apply it. Now, there are different flavors or different versions of the ATT&CK framework, and we're going to focus specifically on the industrial control system, or the ICS version, as that's going to be our best fit for industrial applications. Next, we'll look at the Cyber PHA methodology and understand when people say Cyber PHA, what do they really mean? What are the steps involved? And so cover an overview there. And then lastly, we'll look at how do the attack methodology and the Cyber PHA methodology, how are they related? And then look to see, is there a strategy or a way that we can combine the two together? And so to get started, we'll focus with the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. And so the first place to start, or some logical questions, would be, well, what is MITRE? And so MITRE is a US government-funded research organization. It is based out of Bedford, Massachusetts and McLean, Virginia. And it does, again, lots of different research projects, but a large focus for them is cybersecurity practices. And they are funded and supported by NIST for this. Now, the next question would be, okay, well, what does the acronym MITRE stand for? And this is one that actually surprised me, but it doesn't stand for anything particular. It's just meant to be a cool name. Now, with the kind of organization being founded out of Massachusetts, it was spun off from MIT, and so a lot of people thought it stood for Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Research and Engineering, but it was really just made by a board member to be cool. So I thought that was a fun little bit of background, fun little bit of history on it. And then the next question is, well, ATT&CK's also a pretty cool acronym. Does that stand for something, or is it more of just a name? And in this case, ATT&CK is a full acronym, and it stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. And so from a tactics standpoint, these are the approaches, or really the steps that the attackers are going to take in order to achieve, in order to reach their final objective. So for this example, we could think about reconnaissance, so gathering some information on the system, initial access, finding a way to get a foothold or a starting point in the system, and then execution, where they're looking to run malicious code, execute malware, or again, whatever part of their attack they're trying to get to run on the system. The next T for techniques is then our really method, or our how, for the adversaries and how they go through and complete each of those tactics. And so each tactic will have multiple techniques within it. So an example of a way to complete reconnaissance may be active scanning, so trying to see, are there any internet exposed endpoints out there? Then for our initial access, we could take advantage of those exposed endpoints. We could use a phishing campaign, a watering hole type attack. There are lots of, again, different ways that we can break in and get initial access to a system. And then for the execution, for example, we might use, a command and scripting interpreter, anything that we can use to execute or run that malicious code. So then the last part of the acronym, the common knowledge, this sometimes is referred to as procedures, but really it's looking at more highly detailed descriptions of the behavior or the activity for a technique. So providing that real strong basis so that when we're reading through the techniques, trying to understand them, protect against them, we have a little bit of a better background. We can see how attackers are actually going through and doing that type of technique in real world case studies and real world incidents. And so with just a little bit of background on what the framework is, then the next question would be, well, what is the goal or the purpose of MITRE ATT&CK? And so we can think about the background of what it is. So it's this comprehensive list of adversary tactics and techniques that they will use during a cyber attack. It is based on real world observation. So, it wasn't just researchers sitting in a lab and brainstorming ideas of how people could compromise systems. They're looking at real world events, trying to understand for these different cyber attacks that have happened, what were the specific steps? What were the actions that the attackers took? And from there, the idea is to have a foundation for developing specific threat models to better understand example attacks or thought exercises of how the attackers may get into the system. And another thing to note is there are multiple attack collections. And so, as mentioned, we will really be focusing on the industrial control system tactics, but there are tactics for enterprise systems, there are tactics for mobile systems. And so really it's meant to give us that good, consistent starting point for an industry or an area so we can better break down and make our specific threat models. And so with that use of it, the ultimate goal is that we can improve cyber defense by understanding those common strategies and then finding the best ways to protect against them. So really, understanding the way that the attacker on the other side of the security equation is, so that we can better bolster our defenses against them. And so to start, we can look at the ICS ATT&CK Tactics, and there are 12 specific tactics that are applied to industrial control systems. And we'll look at each of these. They are numbered, but they don't have to go in order. And again, we won't dive into detail, but it's more to just provide a little bit of background or an understanding on what each of these tactics are. So for our first one, our initial access, this quite simply is just attackers getting into the ICS network, looking to establish that initial foothold for the rest of the attack. Execution is how they run that malicious code. So it could be like we talked about, command or scripting, basically anything that will start the malware running. For worms, in some cases, there's actually no user action required to have the malware run, but it's just automatically going to execute and spread to, again, all of the systems it can find and connect to. The next one, persistence, is a critical one for attackers to maintain their foothold. So they've done all of that work to get onto the system, and they want to make sure that they aren't missing it, that they don't lose out on it and accidentally get booted off the system. And one of the main ways that that could happen would be, say, a restart. And so our classic IT response is to turn off the computer and turn it back on again to see if that resets the memory and has it again work the way it's intended. And so the attackers want to make sure that they are able to maintain their foothold in the system and not lose it when it restarts. So whether it is changing configurations or changing settings, they're going to look to have that continual access opportunity. The next step or the next tactic is privilege escalation. And here, so we can think about gaining those higher level permissions, what steps do they need to take to get admin access so they can make their desired changes to the system. And so again, that could either be finding administrator accounts, it could be taking advantage of vulnerabilities to forcibly escalate privileges. So there are a couple of different things we can look at there. For evasion, this is now a game of cat and mouse. And so how do the attackers avoid the cybersecurity defenses of the system? How do they avoid detection? And so what can they do to keep a low profile when going through and executing the attack? For discovery, this is finding out details about the system or environment, understanding what devices are connected to it, understanding how they're connected together and what communications are there, all so that they can better plan out the attack and understand what systems they have to get to to execute an attack. For lateral movement, this is quite simply moving throughout the ICS environment. And so, if you think about attackers, once they break through a firewall and get access to a zone, there's generally relatively few restrictions to moving laterally within a zone. So this is getting from whatever asset they're on to their target asset where they want to make a specific change or, again, have access to the system in a certain way. For collection, this is somewhat similar to discovery, but it's more about gathering data. So if they need to pull configurations, if they need to, again, get information about how a system is functioning, to then use that to change the configuration or better design their final attack, that's what they'll be doing at this stage. For command and control, this is the process of setting up an external server or an external workstation where they can, easily and remotely make changes to compromised systems, again, to achieve their desired impact. And then for the final steps of the attack, we can think about, well, what are all of the things in an ICS system that can be manipulated or modified in order to try to achieve a goal? So one of the first things to look at is inhibiting the response. So what do the attackers need to do to prevent safety and control systems from automatically responding effectively? What do they need to do to prevent operator intervention so that when they flip the switch in the attack, that there's nothing to prevent them from achieving their desired consequence? We can also look at impairing the process control directly, so manipulating, disabling, or damaging the physical control of the process. So having a basic process control system loop set to an unsafe condition, having a process excursion that they're directly triggering and initiating event, that would be what we could look at for this impair of the process control. And then lastly, for impact, this is manipulating, interrupting, or destroying the ICS system, data, or the physical surrounding area if they're trying to cause physical equipment damage, loss of containment, any sort of environmental impact would fall into that surrounding area classification. And so with these tactics, we've got some different, simple rules of the road or ways that we can work with them. So the first one is, unlike the cyber kill chain, which again covers similar tactics but goes one step at a time where attackers have to go through each of those steps. The tactics are not something that an adversary needs to do each and every time, and they also don't have to be used in a specific order. Now, there are some like initial access that are always going to be done towards the beginning. And then at the end, impact is that desired final objective that they're trying to achieve. But really anything in the middle we can shuffle around based on how they are moving throughout the system, based on whatever approach they are using there. And we can also see that we can put multiple pieces of these tactics together to build a threat model. So we can use each one as a building block to understand the overall pathway or the overall approach that the attackers may use to get through the system and execute changes. And so now that we've got an understanding of the tactics, our next key for techniques are really the how of each of those activities. So it's the specific way that an adversary can complete the tactic. And this helps us to, again, drill down into greater granularity. So we've got, let's say with initial access, we've got a little bit over 10 different techniques that we can use to try to establish access. Within those, we can have sub-techniques where we get even more granular to really understand all of the specific versions or ways that an attacker can do that. And so, if we were to go through all of the techniques, we would certainly be on here longer than an hour webinar. But what I do want to do is just drill down for our initial access techniques and spend a little bit of time to look at these in just a little bit of detail to provide some background on what is typically included in techniques. as well as relate these to some common industrial cybersecurity incidents that we have already seen. So for our drive-by compromise, this a lot of times will be done as an infected website where anyone who visits that website will essentially be exposed to that malware without necessarily clicking on any other links or clicking on anything on the website. And if we think about the NotPetya attack, this happened where anyone who went to the update server for the Ukrainian tax software had the NotPetya virus, or I think it was a worm in that case, installed on their system where it would then spread. For our public-facing applications, so these are, again, if attackers are doing, general network scans to see is anything exposed and out facing the public, that can be used as a starting point to attack. Remote services can be exploited by software vulnerabilities or external remote services if they compromise the VPN or whatever remote access program is being used, or the account for those, they can use that to gain access. If you've got, similar to public-facing applications, if you've got, physical devices that are internet accessible, we can think about modems with legacy protections. For the example of the New York Dam, it did have a password, but it was pretty easy for the attackers to brute force that and then gain access. And those legacy modems are quite common in the water industry or really anything with SCADA systems that are a little bit more widely spread. We need different ways of gaining access to those systems. Remote services internal can also be targeted. We could have replication through removable media, such as a USB stick like the Stuxnet attack. For a rogue master, this one's not a little bit, is a little bit less clear just based on the name, but that's really having basically a rogue device that's the right type to connect and providing a false third-party access point. And so this was actually the type of attack used in the Marucci Shire incident, where the former employee who is disgruntled had stolen, the right radio to have access. He knew all of the IP addresses, and so he was just able to drive around, get within range, and then begin making changes from that rogue master device. Phishing attachments are very common for gaining access to the corporate network and then looking to transition to the IT network from there. We could look at the supply chain compromise. So understanding, ways to compromise and then really corrupt devices either while they're being manufactured or during the shipment and installation. That is a strategy that is, really hard to protect against, but a lot of times takes a more sophisticated, say, nation state type actor to really execute one of those attacks effectively. The transient cyber asset was actually one that, as I started to dig more into the attack techniques, I was very glad to find here, because a lot of times I feel like it is missed in risk assessments. But it is something that when I've been going through and reviewing risk assessments for customers, that a lot of times hasn't been addressed fully. And what we mean by transient cyber asset here is something that's not always connected to the control system, but that does get connected from time to time. So a maintenance laptop or a configuration laptop used by a vendor is kind of the classic example of that transient asset. And these are really critical because they have many times all of the software that you need to make changes, but they don't have many protections. And I've even been on sites doing audits where I've just seen them really left out in the open, where anyone who wanted to pick up that laptop and plug it in would be very close to being able to make configuration changes. And then lastly, we can think about wireless compromise. So any devices that are Wi-Fi or Bluetooth enabled. We could look at radio or 4G components, anything with that wireless method of gaining access. And so that is certainly not a detailed dive through the attack methodology, but hopefully that provides a bit of an overview or a bit of a background on what's included. And then we will look at some specific threat models a little bit later on when we look at best strategies or best practices for using these approaches. And so for our next portion, we'll look at the Cyber PHA methodology. And a good place to start is, well, when we say Cyber PHA, what does that mean? Because there are lots of different risk assessment terms and methods that get thrown around, and it's important to know what is or is not interchangeable. So Cyber PHA stands for Cybersecurity Process Hazard Analysis. Anyone who's familiar with the functional or process safety side, it really is based on tailoring those safety-based risk assessment approaches for PHA and applying that to a cybersecurity methodology. In some cases, it is called Cyber HAZOP, and I know in the CCPS concept book, we do use the term Cyber HAZOP to describe it. Or if we look at tying it back to the IEC 62443 methodology, the 3-2 portion of the standard looks at cybersecurity risk assessment in two parts. The first being our initial high-level risk assessment, where we are just identifying consequence and consequence severity, and then the detailed risk assessment, where for those high consequence or those high criticality components, we really dive down to greater detail. And it's that detailed risk assessment that really follows the same methodology as Cyber PHA and would go through that same HAZOP worksheet-based approach. And so if we look at our detailed risk assessment, we have quite a few pieces that we need going into it. We want the results of our high-level risk assessment. So what are the critical assets we need to focus on? A zone and conduit diagram, so our network architecture with our planned firewalls showing the segmentation between different zones. Our process hazard analysis input, so what are the physical hazards for safety, environmental, or equipment damage that attackers could cause? So having that HAZOP done ahead of time, or at least having access to those HAZOP consequences, is an important step. Our organizational risk criteria, so our risk matrix, our consequence matrix, our likelihood criteria, to really help us rank and consistently assess where a given threat scenario would fall. And then we can also look to have a vulnerability analysis that shows us what are the holes in our current system, what software vulnerabilities are currently in place that attackers could exploit. And so with all of that information, we then go through and have 4 main steps for completing our Cyber PHA. The first is to document the threat and the threat likelihood. Then we would look at the possible consequences of the compromise, identify and list our countermeasures that help to reduce the likelihood of that consequence occurring, and then document the final likelihood now considering those countermeasures and make a determination of where we currently are from a risk standpoint. Is the system adequately protected? Do we have additional activities that we need to take, recommendations for improving risk reduction? And that'll feed us into future lifecycle steps like our security level verification, help us to define our cybersecurity requirement specs. So there's a lot that we can take and pull from this. And we're going to look at a couple key points for each of these steps in the next few slides. But I do want to mention that this is definitely more of a high-level overview of detailed risk assessment. We do have quite a few webinars that dive into risk assessment in depth. And so if you aren't as familiar with this method, I would recommend checking those out for a little bit of further background. But at a high level, or at a simple level from the threat standpoint, we want to think about the specific paths that attackers can take to gain access to the system. And so the way we'll do that is by listing threat vectors. And this can range really anywhere from a list of 300 plus very specific cyber terms and ways of getting in, to a simple list of 6 or so main areas that attackers will typically look at. And then within each of those pathways, we want to think about what are the specific steps an attacker could take for a given system to try to gain access through that method. Once we've gone ahead and listed the potential threats, we then need to think about, well, how likely is a given threat to occur? And this is a bit of an ongoing debate or an ongoing discussion within the cybersecurity community of how much do we really want to consider likelihood in cyber risk assessments. One train of thought is that because we don't have good enough data for it, and because cyber attacks are happening so frequently, we really need to just assume that the attack is occurring and that we are, facing cyber attack from sophisticated actors, and then look at, okay, what are the best ways to protect against those attacks? The other approach is to acknowledge that, again, we don't have as much data, but we know that the relative likelihood of cybersecurity attacks differs based on the level of skill, and to try to estimate the likelihood that way by still being conservative, but documenting that, a general malware attack may happen at a very high frequency, and is something where an organization is going to face that more often than, say, a nation state type attack. And so again, different organizations have different approaches. We have certainly done risk assessment both ways. I'll admit that my preference is a little bit more towards the likelihood side, because I just have a hard time calling it a risk assessment if we're not looking at likelihood and consequence. But again, there are definitely different approaches out there for that step. The next piece is, as mentioned, to really look at the possible consequences and understand that cyber attacks on industrial systems can really have a wide range of impacts. We can have business impacts like loss of confidential data, reputational harm. We can have physical implications like unexpected downtime. We can have physical equipment damage. That really, again, we need to repair the physical process equipment. We have downtime while that's occurring, so that can be a more severe business type consequence. From the safety side, it's possible for attackers to trigger hazardous events. So by failing BPCS loops, we can get processes out of control, out of specification. We can have safety concerns by disabling, safety loops and potentially having a loss of containment event or another unsafe condition. So there are a lot of different things that can be triggered by these cyber attacks. And so after we identify our starting likelihood, after we identify our consequence, we then want to think about all of our countermeasures or the potential protections that we can use to reduce the likelihood of the attack occurring. And so here we use countermeasure. On the process hazard analysis side, we use safeguard, but we're really looking at what are the protections that will prevent an attacker from gaining access and achieving their specific objective. And there are really three different types of countermeasures we can think about. We can think about attacks that are preventative, that reduce the likelihood of an attacker gaining entry into the system. We can reduce the likelihood that the attack goes unnoticed, so have better monitoring, more opportunities to identify and potentially respond to the attack before they achieve their objective. Or we can have countermeasures to reduce the consequence of the attack. Pressure release valves that are going to make the consequence of an overpressure less severe, because it's going to be more likely to be a loss of product or some venting, as opposed to equipment rupture or dikes or mechanical barriers that prevent environmental releases from being as bad. And so we can think about building these different layers to have more protections between a potential threat and the heart of the control system to, again, be able to reduce that likelihood of getting to that undesirable scenario. And so ultimately, when we put all of this together, we get something that looks very similar to a PHA worksheet, but is focused on the cybersecurity side of things. And so for exida, when we go ahead and do risk assessments, we use the Excellential Cyber tool or the Cyber Facts module. And this, again, we can see that our different threats and our threat likelihoods are there. We have our consequence description with the severity. Our risk criteria automatically populate the given risk based on that likelihood and consequence severity. We can identify the countermeasures to say, okay, what specific steps are we taking to reduce that likelihood? And then if we still are at a high risk or if we're at an unacceptable risk, we can make recommendations to then further reduce the risk, take additional actions. And so that gives just a quick overview on Cyber PHA. But from there, then we can look to answer the question of, well, how are the attack framework and Cyber PHA related? So first, for a quick summary, so our attack framework is a collection of potential tactics and techniques used by adversaries. This is really our common classifications of attack behaviors, and we can use this to build good threat models. For the Cyber PHA methodology, this is an approach for cyber risk assessment. We focus on the threats, the consequences, the countermeasures for reducing the potential to get to that consequence. And really then we use that to make a determination on likelihood and consequence to really have an effective risk ranking. And the goal overall for the attack framework is to make organizations more secure by better understanding attackers and their techniques. The goal for Cyber PHA is to make organizations more secure by better understanding their weak points where they can be compromised, and also to understand where their existing cybersecurity protections are and where they need to focus on future cyber protections. And so with that in mind, we can think about, okay, so for the attack framework and Cyber PHA, what's the consensus? Are these two competing, conflicting approaches where one will win out and everyone will use it? Are they complementary approaches where we can use both of them at the same time, potentially to strengthen either method? And as you may be able to guess from the information so far, they really are much more complementary approaches than competing. And we'll talk about and see how we can really align them together to take advantage of our understanding of the threat actor behavior to then better fill out our cybersecurity risk assessment and better identify opportunities for protections. And so if we look at specifically how we can adjust and align the two approaches, we can start with our basic steps for the Cyber PHA and look to overlay additional supporting information from attack. And so for the step of documenting threat and threat likelihood, we can look at our initial access tactic, and then really all of our techniques and sub-techniques there are going to help us better quantify our threat vectors and have a good understanding of what questions we need to ask to understand how attackers may get into a system. Next, we can look at determining the possible consequences of compromise. So what is the impact? Are they able to manipulate, interrupt, or destroy data, systems, or the physical surroundings? And when we complete this impact, that's going to help us easily estimate and identify our consequences and our consequence severity. And then for our countermeasures, we can think about what are the steps that attackers are going to have to go through for a typical attack, B, if we identify a high consequence scenario, what are the steps that they have to take through in order to get there? And by understanding those steps and focusing in on what can we do to prevent the attacker from being successful at each of those steps, we can better identify what countermeasures we need to have present for the system. And as we identify those countermeasures, the more we have, the more opportunities we're going to have to reduce the likelihood and improve our overall risk ranking. And so if we look at just some of the details of how we can use this approach for improving the threat vectors, we can, in Exlentia or whatever tool we choose to use, we can look to define those threat vectors based on the techniques for gaining initial access. And so we can pre-populate, we can kind of drive ourselves to look at each of those questions and answer how might an attacker use that technique for a given asset. And then we can go ahead and use our threat model as our next step. And so the example that a lot of times I'll point to is a production facility that takes 1,3-butadiene and produces polystyrene. And this is something that I actually worked on at university as my capstone course. So it's a good example where I have a lot of information on it, but none of it is confidential, and I'm allowed to talk about it and make some detailed examples on it. And so for our initial example, we could think about attackers using phishing to gain access to the system. And as soon as a user clicks on that link or clicks on the attachment, then they can start to make changes on the system. If they then have that compromised account and they then use that account to connect not only to the enterprise but to the ICS network, they're going to quickly have access to those higher tier credentials, especially if we haven't followed least privilege for our network, where we only have operator accounts and admin accounts, and everyone in engineering has an admin account. From there, then they can look to suppress alarms so that the control system doesn't notify operators. They can modify parameters in the DCS configuration so that we have an initiating event or a failure of the control loop, that we lose any protective control functions. And then ultimately for our impact, we could have a loss of safety due to basically disabling any of those safety critical protections and setting them to a point where they'll never activate, or whatever steps the attacker choose to modify there, we can then have a pretty significant impact. And we can take that impact and then use it to help us better describe our consequence severity. And so with our detailed example here, that potential fatality coordinates back to our consequence severity 3 from our severity matrix. And so by going through and building out that threat model, we understand what assets the attacker is getting to, and we understand what the attacker can change from that asset. So from the engineering workstation, the controls, the alarms, and the safety controls that they can disable or make ineffective. And so then as we look to better protect against this scenario, we can think about, well, what are some basic steps we can take to make this attack more difficult? Because as we outlined in the first threat model, there's really not much. There aren't many barriers preventing an attacker from gaining access. And so one simple thing we could do would be to separate out our corporate or enterprise accounts from our ICS accounts so that there's not a single set of credentials that gets attackers from a remote area directly to the control system with just that one username and password. And then from there, we can also think about improving our user credentialing on the ICS side, having better user management, restricting the number of admin accounts, and again, really limiting how often those accounts can be used. Maybe we don't allow remote access to admin accounts. And those are some very simple account-based things that we can change. But even if we just do that, that then significantly increases the difficulty, and attackers are going to have more steps before they can get to their impact. So they may have to use some sort of password finder, such as Mimikatz, which was used in the PHA attack, to then find those credentials for the ICS account once they get a foothold. And there, even after they have that movement, they then still need to identify where their target systems are. They have to go through privilege escalation to move from a remote account or an engineering account to an admin account. So we're adding layers, adding more complexity on, again, what they need to do in order to achieve their objective. And then lastly, we can think about adding additional countermeasures to, again, we're not going to be able to indefinitely prevent attackers from gaining access to the system, but we can make it much more difficult for them. And as we understand the specific tactics or steps that they need to complete to, again, achieve a specific consequence, compromise a given part of the system, as we start to have better protections, we take those options, we take those tools out of their toolkit, and we make it much harder for them to be successful. So for our spear phishing, improved operator training, phishing awareness campaigns are going to make it less likely that we have personnel clicking on those links. If we run antivirus or endpoint protection on business assets, we may be more able to identify malware when it's executing and automatically stop that from occurring on business laptops, so that they don't have the opportunity to then remotely connect into our ICS environment. We could think about secure password storage, patching known vulnerabilities that allow those different types of password exploits to be run. We could think about limiting the number of accounts, requiring on-site approval for remote access to make it harder to get a remote connection. We can disable common network sniffing protocols as just a best practice on the ICS to make it harder to find devices. We can, again, further limit the number of accounts. We can patch for known vulnerabilities so that there aren't as many exploits to use. We can have dual approval for critical changes so that 2 people have to agree to make a change if it could affect safety, for example. We could have hard-coded endpoints for our parameters so that you're not able to just change a configuration to an unsafe limit from the the base configurator or from changing set points, but you have to go deeper into the system, provide additional steps to make that change. We can have isolated safety systems to really separate out our user accounts for control from our accounts for our safety activities. And so all of these things make it more and more difficult for the attackers to be successful. And when we put it all together, we can take advantage of those techniques for the initial access, use those as our threat vectors. We can use our impact description to start our consequence and improve our consequence severity ranking. And then we can list countermeasures that we identify by considering the different tactics and use that in order to reduce our likelihood, hopefully to an acceptably low level. And so in summary, we looked at the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, understanding the basis for it, how we can take advantage of it. We looked at an overview of the Cyber PHA methodology, and then we looked at specific strategies for combining the two and using a little bit of a hybrid or a combined approach. And so I'm going to run through just a couple of quick outro slides. I have seen a couple of questions come through throughout the presentation, and we should have about 10 minutes at the end to go through and answer those. And so from the training side, this is always a great place to start. If you're interested in learning more about any industrial related topics, we've got great training courses on functional safety, on cybersecurity, and on alarm management. And the cybersecurity course CS100 is a newer 4-day course that we're running that has really expanded the CS102 course, which was 2 days, into a more full lifecycle course. We've added additional workshop problems, really so that we can help to dive a little bit deeper on the topics and have better coverage than we were able to achieve in 2 days. So that is something that is a good option. And for the online self-paced, that is, you sign up for the course, you have access to it for 2 months, and you can really go through whenever is convenient to you to complete those course modules. In addition to the online self-paced options, we also have a number of upcoming online live as well as in-person courses where you have a live instructor to go through the material. And so again, we've got safety courses coming up, and before the end of the year, we do have a session of the CS100 course that is going to run. So that is a good option if you want to go through the material, but want to have a live instructor to help with questions as you go through it. And then if you want to know more about exida, or if this topic was interesting and you want to learn more about future or similar topics, don't hesitate to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. we do provide updates on upcoming webinars and other information and resources that exida has available. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I am always happy to connect and really keep the discussion going there. Or a lot of times if I'm slow on LinkedIn, you may get a fast response if you just email me at pobrien@exida.com. But always happy to keep the discussion going from the webinar and follow up on any questions that we don't have time to fully answer now. So without further ado, let's jump ahead and look at the questions. So the first question I have here is, like IEC 62151 safety lifecycle, is there a cybersecurity lifecycle in the standard? And so yes, so IEC 62443 does help outline a lifecycle-based approach, and we can think about lining it up with a similar assess phase, where you're doing your risk assessment, your implement and design phase, and then your operations and maintenance. And so that is something that we can look at in IEC 62443. The ISA technical report TR 84.00.09 is another really good reference there, and it helps to directly line up the safety and cybersecurity life cycles together. The next question we have is, are there any personnel certification programs? And yes, we do absolutely have those. So for cybersecurity, we have our Certified Automation Cybersecurity Expert and our Certified Automation Cybersecurity Specialist exams, which are personnel certification exams, and they follow the same approach as our CFSP and CFSC exams on the safety side. So those are multiple choice exams that if you go through and score an 80%, you can achieve personnel certification as long as you have the necessary background and experience. And so in addition to the personnel certification exams themselves, we do also have study guides as well as our cybersecurity courses and books, lots of things that help to really prepare and get ready to complete those activities. And so that would definitely be something that I would recommend looking into. And we've really seen the amount of applicants for that exam sharply increase over the last couple of years. People are certainly looking for those cybersecurity credentials, and this is a good way to get a really industrial focused cybersecurity credential. Okay, another question that I'm seeing here is, is using the attack methodology, is that a mandatory standard requirement? So if we look at the IEC 62443 3-2 methodology, does it say, use the attack framework, use these specific threat vectors? And so the short answer is no, the standard does not point to any specific methodology or have any restrictions on what threats need to be considered. So it's more so an opportunity to improve the robustness of the risk assessment methodology, or to help identify where those threats should come from and where we can identify countermeasures. So it's really more of a an optional methodology to have better alignment between the two activities. So another question we have is, are the slides going to be shared for the PowerPoint, or is the session going to be posted? So we are no longer sharing any of our end user slides, just for some IP concerns. We spent a lot of time developing them, so we don't share those slides. But we will have a recording of the webinar posted probably early next week that you will be able to find on the exida website or on YouTube to go back through if you want to rewatch any parts or look at any of the details. And then additionally, if you have any specific questions on the material that you want to talk about more, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always happy to to look at anything or to go through something in a little bit more detail. Okay, so it looks like those are all of our questions for today. So I just want to thank everyone very much for your time. And I am Patrick O'Brien, and this was How Does the MITRE ATT&CK Framework Align with Cyber PHA? Thanks.